Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Mark Montgomery. He's with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's the senior director at the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation there. Also, he was the senior advisor, or is the senior advisor, for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Mr. Montgomery, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Pedro.
A couple of things about your organization. What is the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and particularly when it comes to cyber issues, what's your main point of interest?
So the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank in Washington. It looks at a number of security issues, and it specifically has three centers, one on military power, one on economic power, and one on cyber and technology innovation. I run the Cyber and Technology Innovation Center at FDD, and we really focus on how do we make our critical infrastructure more secure, both from nation-state adversaries, but also from criminal actors.
And then when it comes to the your other title, this Cyberspace Solarium Commission, what is that specifically?
So the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was set up by the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. It came about because senators like John McCain, who I worked for at the time on the Senate Armed Services Committee, were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with our ability to deal with cybersecurity threats, particularly below what we call the use of force. In other words, threats done by nation states or criminal actors that didn't engender a response from the United States. So he was, what Senator McCain came to the conclusion was deterrence theory was not working throughout all of cyberspace. At that lower level, malicious actors were able to do quite a bit of damage to our national critical infrastructure. So he did what any congressman would do, which is set up a commission. And the reason he believed in this was because he had been working for 10 years to try to get cybersecurity more secure through working with the executive branch or through legislative changes, and it just wasn't happening. So working with the Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate all agreed to this, and a commission was set up. And Senator McCain, really smart man on how to get things done, he made sure we had 4 congressional members appointed to the commission. Senator Angus King of Maine, who's an independent, caucuses with the Democrats. Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican from Nebraska. Representative Jim Langevin, a Democrat from Rhode Island, and Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. In addition, we had we appointed 4 executive branch managers to bring a lot of information in. You know, the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the deputy secretary of defense, the deputy secretary of Homeland Security, and the deputy director of national intelligence. And then in addition, we had 6 kind of outside experts, either CEOs of companies, former government officials, think tank leaders. So those 14 commissioners were supported by staff that I led that studied the cybersecurity problem. And McCain said, you have 1 year to come back to us with real solutions, which is a very fast turn rate. So in about 9 months, we produced a final report that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission issued in March of 2020. Since then, we put out 6 additional white papers looking at individual issues, but we've then spent the last 18 months, 2 legislative cycles, the fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2022 legislative cycles, trying to turn the recommendations of that commission into law. And we've been highly successful. We had about 82 original recommendations, 50 of which were legislative. And we've accomplished depending how you measure it, between 60 and 80% of those recommendations are either in law or being carried out by the executive branch, which is a very high strike rate. And in fact, the commission itself stood down over the weekend. You know, it reached its natural length by Congress. And we've now stood up a non-governmental organization called cybersolarium.org, again, led by the same congressman, same outside experts. And I'm serving as executive director again. And it's a 501c3. We're a nonprofit. We're going to continue to advocate for implementing all those original reports.
Well, as far as the issues that in the world of cyber threats, we hear a lot of them. Many are common to Americans today, denial of service or ransomware, but you focus particularly in a recent op-ed on cyber threats, particularly when it comes to water systems in the United States. What got your interest in this?
Well, the commission pointed out that there were 3 or 4 of our 16 critical infrastructures, and there are 16 critical infrastructures by presidential executive order. You may remember that President Biden kind of famously showed this list to President Putin and said, stay away from these critical infrastructures. But the Cyberspace Solarium Commission had looked at those 16, and several of them concerned us greatly. One was pipelines, another was water, a third was healthcare provision. And so the commissioners asked a bunch of us to, or different think tanks, to take a look at some of these issues in detail. The water one really concerned me, and the reason I took it up personally was because I think water is that critical infrastructure that's at the nexus of national security, economic stability, and public health and safety. Kind of the three different ways you can become a critical infrastructure. Water's in all of them, and it really enhances the other and informs and enables the other critical infrastructures. In other words, our energy infrastructure relies heavily on the water infrastructure as a cooling medium and an effluent in its system, so that if water isn't functioning in a certain region, it's likely that very rapidly thereafter energy won't be energy production won't be functioning. So seeing this as a critical infrastructure, and really the weakest link in these critical infrastructures, we went and took a study on it.
And so because the op-ed talks a lot about the specifics, but you highlight the experiences of one small town in Florida. What's that experience? And what does it say about the larger issue of a cyber threat toward a water system?
Yeah, thanks. So, the event we highlight was in Oldsmar, Florida, about 11 months ago, just before the Super Bowl. And what happened was a malicious cyber actor, still not identified, had gotten into the system, probably through either a pre-existing flaw or the delivery of a spear phishing that hasn't been revealed yet by the FBI, and was able to manipulate the system. And what this person targeted was a little unusual in the sense that she or he didn't try to turn the system off and ransomware back control of the system, or take complete control and lock out the operators. They instead decided to change the chemical injection pump settings, so the amount of lye that was controls the acidity of water. It both, it initially at low levels makes the water more appropriate to drink. At high levels, it can make the water poisonous or detrimental to health, and began to attempt to increase the level of lye in the water. Now, fortunately, he was doing the malicious actor was doing this at the same time. In other words, moving around the system, cursors in the system at the same time that an operator was sitting at the console. So the operator was able to see this inappropriate activity going on. Now, the irony is he saw it twice. The first time he didn't do anything about it. The second time, about an hour later, he did report it to his bosses, and they were able to stop this potentially harmful change in the chemistry. But that was a random act of luck that we were able to stop this. And I'm glad we were lucky, but it points to the fact that our systems are incredibly vulnerable to malicious acts by either criminal actors or nation states. And as you study this issue more, there's a number of other examples. Now, water hasn't been exploited in the same way that financial services or banks have, because there criminals are going to rob money, and therefore there's a much more lucrative path to success. But our water critical infrastructure is exceptionally vulnerable to cyber penetration.
Our guest with us until 8:45, and if you want to ask him questions about these vulnerabilities that he talks about and highlights in a report and his op-ed, you can call 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. You can also text us thoughts at 202-748-8003. Mr. Montgomery, talk about the water aspect, but you can also talk about other vulnerable systems as well. What makes them currently vulnerable, generally?
So generally, I'll go with water and then take it out generally. What makes us vulnerable, particularly say in the water industry, is that there's two elements to this. First is how much does the industry spend on its cybersecurity, and the second is how well does the government agency that's paired with that industry support it. If both of those are strong, you're in good shape. So I'll give you an example. In financial services, the banks have over 20 years, particularly the big banks, have learned, hey, we're really, susceptible to, and we are being targeted heavily by cyber criminal actors. So some of our really big banks in America spend upwards of $700 million a year $700 million a year on cybersecurity. That's more than most federal agencies, except the Department of Defense. That's more than most countries. An individual U.S. bank will be spending that. And they're very highly supported by a heavily regulated industry with a number of regulators, and they're supported by the Department of Treasury. That is a marriage that leads to very high cybersecurity. Now, you can't say that across the tens of thousands of banks in America, but you can broadly say it across the industry, and very specifically say it about our biggest banks. But when you get down to water utilities are generally more than, I think it's about 88% publicly owned and operated by your county, your town, some kind of local government organization. That is not the definition of an organization that's going to be rich with excess funds or able to rapidly give a grant or funding to solve a developing security issue. So, they're very much governed by rates that they're allowed to charge, bonds to raise money. It's a very slow, not agile response mechanism. And the really complicating factor is that about 2 decades ago, we began to heavily automate the water industry. In other words, take the man or woman out of the loop and make the valve or the pump or the chemical injection system operate by computer order. At the time, there didn't appear to be a big cybersecurity threat. So the savings that came from that were invested in other areas. Well, now, 20 years later, there's a big cybersecurity threat. We've heavily automated these systems, and we don't have the excess funds to pay for them. So the industry itself has got to do more it's got to spend more money on cybersecurity. In that regard, the government needs the Sector Risk Management Agency, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has not been properly resourced or organized to support the utilities in their cybersecurity effort. The EPA is a big federal agency. It's got a lot of important roles. It spends a lot of its effort on important issues like removing the lead-based piping in our water systems and working on climate change issues. But they have not focused, through multiple administrations in a bipartisan way, they have not focused on cybersecurity. As a result, they are very ill prepared to support a weak industry in terms of cybersecurity. And the best example of this is that their Office of Water Cybersecurity probably has under 5 people in it. And when you compare that, there are 55,000 water utilities and 15,000 wastewater utilities, 5 people trying to help 70,000 bureaucratic organizations. That's not the kind of way you'll get there. So what you really have to get is a good government support agency married with a good with a well-funded industry. That's when you'll have tight cybersecurity.
Again, Mark Montgomery with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's their senior director of the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation. If you want to ask him questions about these cyber concerns, particularly these infrastructure systems that he talks about, you can call the lines. You can send us a text at 202-748-8003. James in Washington, D.C., independent line. Good morning. You're first up.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thank you for having me. So my question to Mr. Montgomery is our energy grid at risk as well? And the second question, how do we move forward with legislation? How do we get our, I guess you could say, legislative branch to act on this? Because it seems like, we're now in the 21st century, and this should have been taken care of in the 1990s, to be honest with you.
Those are 2 great questions. The first on energy. Energy is in a better position. A couple reasons drive that. One, a lot of energy is privately owned, not publicly owned. So they have the ability to adjust rates, which may not always be a comfortable thing as a utility payer, but does allow them to respond to these cybersecurity issues more agilely. It's more around 10 to 15% publicly owned electrical utilities versus the 88% I mentioned in the water. They've also been, the Department of Energy has actually been an exceptionally good sector risk management agency. They have applied themselves. They've created an assistant secretary that deals with cybersecurity. That happened during the Trump administration. So far, the Biden administration has not appointed somebody. And on occasion, the Secretary of Energy has indicated she might drop the seniority of that job. I hope Secretary Granholm's unsuccessful in that effort. Both Republican and Democratic senators have pushed back against that. But in general, she does make sure there's enough funding for that organization. It's literally 20 to 30 times the size of its water equivalent when they should be about the same size. So I feel better about energy. That does not mean energy is secure. It means it has the opportunity to be more secure. There are still vulnerabilities. The same kind of FBI, NSA, Department of Homeland Security report that came out about water, the warning that caused us to write the op-ed. We've had similar warnings in the energy sector as well. So they are under assault, both from criminal actors, particularly trying to conduct ransomware, but also from from nation states that implant malware into our electrical power grid. There have been reports on that. So we still need to worry about energy. And of course, energy is tied to water. If the water fails, the energy's in trouble. So, energy has concerns. As far as legislative action, I will tell you that the legislature has done more in the U.S. Congress has done more in the last 2 years than they've done in the previous 20 years on cybersecurity legislation. I would consider the last, in fact, 3 years of cybersecurity kind of a bonanza. There were 40 cybersecurity legislation laws passed in 3 years ago, 60 2 years ago, and 40 again last year. Mostly in the National Defense Authorization Act, but also in some independent bills. There was cybersecurity legislation passed within the bipartisan infrastructure plan, for example. So they're doing something, but you're correct in saying that they haven't done everything they need to do. And in fact, in our FDD report on water cybersecurity, we detail 3 or 4 different areas where legislative action is still required. And I'll give you one specific one. One of the things that's extremely disappointing and frustrating is that while we do set aside, $14 billion that's over a 5-year period, so about $3 billion a year in very specific grants to water utilities, cybersecurity is allowed to compete with those. But what they're competing with is, like, we tell a water utility, you can spend this grant money on droughts, severe weather issues, natural disasters, rising sea level, or cybersecurity. So you're basically telling the water utility, here's some money, you can spend it on the 4 signs of the apocalypse or water cybersecurity. Invariably, the money gets spent, 99.9% of it, on the 4 signs of the apocalypse, and water cybersecurity is ignored. The problem with water cybersecurity is that it's easy to ignore in the very short term, but in the long term, that aggregated failure to fund cybersecurity upgrades leaves you extremely vulnerable, as if you were having a drought or rising sea levels or a natural disaster. So, that we really need to have some cybersecurity unique funding, so that that's all the utility can spend it on, to ensure that the utility, as they identify risks in their system that are beyond their ability to fund a repair to, they have a place to go for either a grant or a low interest loan, depending on the size and the attributes of that utility.
That's, in fact, some of the recommendations that your organization makes when it comes to government, giving more power to the EPA in the work of the Sector Risk Management Agency, directing some of those grant programs, money to cybersecurity. It also directs the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to support for water structures, and also increase that federal government support there as well. Let's hear from Ian in Winter Park, Florida, Republican line.
Hi, Mr. Montgomery. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for being here. It's very, I really appreciate just being able to talk to you. And so I'm a UCF graduate. I've been in Central Florida for quite some time, and I will say that the water here has been abysmal for quite some time. And I'm just curious, in your personal opinion, what can the Central Florida environment do to improve the water here? Because it's absolutely been terrible for quite some time.
Okay, and there in Florida, Mr. Montgomery, let me take that a step further as far as back to the systems that you were speaking of. How modern are systems at these critical locations? How would you describe that?
Well, here the caller's hitting on a great point, which is that it's really inconsistent, and then there's some very small, water utilities that have a real challenge in upgrading and improving the quality of both the drinkability, the water drinking, but also the security of the systems with it. In fact, when I say there's 50,000 drinking water utilities in America, which is a phenomenal number, over 40,000 of them serve communities of less than 3,000 people. So you can imagine, with just getting the payments from the 3,000 people and the small profits in that, there's almost no room for long-term investment. So really, that's where the government's got to come in. When you set up a system like this, where something is distributed as it is, then the government does have to come in and help a little. And water, like energy and transportation, are one of those things where the government provides the backbone to private sector or public utilities running things. So that's a great example. Let me talk about one of our recommendations and just how it could help. So we have a program that the Department of Agriculture has, this great program called the Circuit Rider Program. And, I kind of imagined the Marlboro Man on a horseback riding around the West, advising water utilities. This is for mom and pop, really small water utilities that serve farms or rural areas. And they're not on a horseback. They're probably in an F-150 driving around, but they're giving advice. The problem is these guys' advice is about, how should my piping be laid down? What's the pressure on this manifold supposed to be? Really important stuff like that, but probably not, he's not breaking out his computer and giving cybersecurity advice. So we recommended a very small program in terms of cost, but I think could have a big impact for these small rural areas. And that's to fund 50 cybersecurity circuit riders. And this is working with the National Rural Water Association. They're the ones who kind of champion this. They're one of the associations for these small rural places. But now you've got 50 guys, men or women, running around servicing these rural and farmland areas. And they're probably not in an F-150. They're probably in like a Prius, but they're driving around and they show up with their computer and say, hey, let me run some penetration testing. Let me examine your system, the cybersecurity of your system, and help get it up to speed so that you're not subject to ransomware. Because farms are just as vulnerable, these small systems are just as vulnerable to small ransomware criminals as big systems are. But that kind of program we could run for $5 million a year and really enhance those kind of smaller industries and kind of help get the water, the cybersecurity of the water on par with some of the other issues that we solve through the Circuit Rider Program.
From Clark in Florida as well, in Brooksville. Hi, Democrats line.
Good morning. I for sure have a lot of care about cyber, but I also have a lot of care about industries and pollutions and runoffs and sewage, and I think it's a much bigger problem. And me personally, I would rather have corporations being monitored and that money going towards that direction.
Okay, that's Clark. Let's hear from Debbie. Debbie in Silver Spring, Maryland. Democrats line. You're next.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Montgomery and Washington Journal. As a tax credit and a public service, since water is inextricably tied to energy, why do not all the oil companies pay for it? And why is that not regulated through the Department of Energy as a mandatory service and tax?
Okay.
So I'll take a whack at that second one. I think the use of the water is generally associated with the energy production, and they do pay for the water they get as a cooling medium. So there is that requirement. How much that's charged for is probably something that can be determined. But I mean, the truth is the water utilities have not been putting the money they have into cybersecurity. So I'm not sure that increasing that rate would necessarily increase water cybersecurity unless we kind of lean on these utilities that, hey, it's time to make that investment. You got the benefits of automation 10 and 20 years ago. You have a lot less people standing watch, operating valves and pumps. Particularly in these large, in a large in terms of size rural system, you'll have valves and pumps that are 10, 20, 30 miles away from the water headquarters of the distribution manifolds, near the reservoirs and such. That's all been automated. The benefits been had. They need to make the investments in cybersecurity, and I think, and I would like to keep management of this with the EPA. They're responsible for all the other elements of water, and they do work on the cleanliness, on the lead pipe abatement, and the purity of the water. They do a lot of great work there at EPA. They just need to come up to speed on the cybersecurity issue.
Mr. Montgomery, we saw a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill passed recently by Congress and signed into law by the president. How much of that dealt with cybersecurity issues, particularly on these critical infrastructures that you describe?
So, hey, that's a great point. And I'll say, when it came out, the president said, one of his talking points was, this bill does a lot about resilience and cybersecurity. And I will say this, it's one of the very first bills, appropriations bills, that highlights cybersecurity specifically. So that's a win. Now, here's where it's a little less of a win. So in the 1.2 trillion, which is 1,200 billion, there was 2 billion worth of cybersecurity. So that's when you do that mathematically, that's 2 over 1,200. So that's a little over 0.1% was spent on cybersecurity. So it's great that it was called out. It's great that there's 2 billion in there, but I want to put it in perspective that it was a pretty small percentage overall. And what it did was it gave some specific money to the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is a critical agency. It's the Department of Homeland Security, and it's really the kind of the quarterback of the federal government's cybersecurity response. They work with every federal agency. They work with the private sector. They work with the national cyber director at the White House. They're kind of that quarterback working on these issues. And they were given about $500 million worth of funds for different things to do, including what's called a cyber response and recovery fund, which is for providing money after the fact, after there's been some kind of cyber event or crisis, to help restore systems rapidly and get them up and going. This was an important thing that our commissioner had been asking for 2 years, and Congress delivered. It also provided $1 billion to state and local governments for cybersecurity of their IT systems. Now, some of that could go towards water. I think by not having a direction to do it in the law, probably a lot less than we would hope is going to go to that. That's really going to go to the cybersecurity and the IT modernization of your state and local governments. This is something that was noticed during the COVID response, when an excessive number of people were applying for like unemployment relief, and the state and local systems were really under duress because they were outdated and outmoded, but they also are unsecure. So the money in theory is for cybersecurity. I think a lot of that $1 billion will be spent on what we call IT modernization, which will improve security a little, but not perfectly efficiently. And so that's in there. Finally, in there is the money I mentioned earlier, about $14 billion overall for grant programs over 5 years for water utilities. And as I said, that my concern there is that cybersecurity was thrown in with the 4 signs of the apocalypse. So I don't think a lot of the grant program, at least historically over the last 15 years, when cybersecurity is kind of an add-on, the money doesn't get spent. And it has a lot to do with how the utilities think, but also with how EPA is organized to handle these grants.
We'll go to Ryan in Benton Harbor, Michigan, independent line.
Good morning, pager old Mr. Montgomery. Benton Harbor recently led that our water situation is the worst in the whole country. It's worse than Flint was when Flint had their crisis. We're like about an hour, 15 minutes from Flint. So I want to ask is, I don't see the urgency that's coming in at all. So I want to know how that system works with the money that just got spent on infrastructure. How do we follow the money to make sure that we're getting the proper responses we should? And in the future, that this doesn't happen again. There should be systems set up to say, hey, now we need to start getting down and look at the infrastructure, whether it's 100 years from now or whatever, because I know the infrastructure hasn't been touched in probably 100 years.
Okay, thanks, Ryan.
Hey, Pedro, I'll say one quick thing. Having studied the infrastructure bill closely, there is money for those sorts of things also. EPA is, in a bipartisan way over a number of years, has been trying to identify, needed investments in infrastructure, in water infrastructure, and there is a significant backlog of hundreds of billions of dollars if you look back at the latest studies. There's also a lot of money in this infrastructure bill and generally in the appropriations for EPA to deal with this, and I think this administration is taking that very seriously.
This is Pat, Keyport, New Jersey. Hi, Republican line.
Hello, I'm a former IT person, so my question is, why aren't these systems closed to outsiders? Why don't you have a list of extremely limited people able to access these systems and make changes? How does someone from the outside get to increase the lie in your water system? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I'll tell you, they should be closed. They still need to be connected to the internet because they're talking to systems downrange, the SCADA systems trying to communicate. But what's generally happening, I think the most likely source of the penetration by the adversary, the cyber criminal actor or malicious actor, is spear phishing. Emails to the operators who then enable a piece of malware by clicking on a link, and the adversary is now in the system. I will tell you, in general, there are three things you can do in cybersecurity that will make you 99.9% secure. Number one is a complex password. Number two is multi-factor authentication. And number three is don't answer emails from Nigerian princes, or more specifically, don't go spear phishing. If you do those three things, don't be subjected, don't hit links that come from unknown sources. If you do those three things, you're going to make yourself, and if you work in a company, your company or your water utility, more secure. Unfortunately, those are not practiced. Often multi-factor authentication is not required. But those are the kind of things that I think would really drive improved cybersecurity.
This is from Stephen in Salem, Oregon, Independent Line.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
You're on. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning, Mark Montgomery. For one, someone I'd like to talk to. I would like to comment. I'd say that the cool thing about self-sustainable energy and the water and the thing that goes with it is that it's off the grid, and it eliminates having to develop a cyber security plan for it, and then local jobs get developed. And we have people actually in their own area continuously working on things if they do break down, if such if they do. And it eliminates that right there in a whole bit, and alleviates even having to worry about it, which is so cool about it. But I want to say that also that cybersecurity threats are always going to be there. There's always going to be someone to develop, if not get through something. But what you just said about spear phishing is awesome, giving that information out there. And I appreciate you, and I just want to know, I just hearing from you right now, it's awesome. I like to get ideas and solutions when I hear people speaking. It just makes me want to think more. And that's all I wanted to say. You guys have a great day.
That's Stephen in Oregon. Mr. Montgomery, when it comes to recommendations, one of the recommendations you put for government and industry when it comes to this issue is a joint industry government cybersecurity oversight program, amongst other things, also to amend the American Water Infrastructure Act and increase wastewater utility risk assessments. To that first point, though, are there not programs already between the government and industry on these issues?
Surprisingly, there's very little in water. And I compare that to, say, financial services, where the big banks would tell you, we don't just have one federal agency regulating our cybersecurity, we have three or four. So what I would tell you is that in this rate, so there was a law passed several years ago called the American Water Infrastructure Act. In there, it directed water utilities to conduct risk assessments and create long-term emergency response plans to emergency recovery plans. And it said to the EPA, you can provide some kind of guidance to how to do this risk assessment. But in the area of cybersecurity, the EPA has not only not provided it on their website until recently, they actually said, we are not giving you a standard for doing this risk assessment in cybersecurity. And I think that's a real fault. They should be providing some kind of standard to be looked at. And it could be scaled based on the size and maturity of your systems, but they should. But I'm at the point now where I really think that that we need a joint industry government cybersecurity oversight program. Probably there's an oversight functions EPA, but the real nuts and bolts of it, managing the standards development, that needs to be done by the water industry. And there are a lot of good water industry associations. There's something called the Water ISAC, Information Sharing and Assistance Group, and there's a water a WSEC, which is kind of the water sector cybersecurity, the council that helps, it works between the government and these associations. They can kind of provide that standards. They can use CISA, that what I mentioned earlier from the Department of Homeland Security, and probably most importantly, NIST, which is the National Information Standards Technology, the National Institute for Standards and Technology at the Department of Commerce, and they provide a ton of standards, recommended standards for different pieces of technology. Those together, they can help develop the water sector cybersecurity standards, and they can work together, consult with different stakeholders, and eventually, if build themselves towards a regulatory regime if that's necessary. If you can do it through a joint oversight, that'd be great. If eventually the EPA needs to take leadership, that'd be fine. But the EPA's years, if not a decade away from being positioned to heavily, to regulate this industry because of their current lack of investment and organization. So that's kind of how I see that government that joint government industry oversight going. It's got to be heavily industry led, at least for the first decade.
We'll hear from Chris in Louisiana. Democrats line, you're next.
Yes, good day, guys. Mark, I want to mention something. Mark, in your explanation, it seems as though, from my understanding, that the EPA is a malfunctioning organization. Because the more I listen to you explain a lot of things, and when it comes to what they're doing, I keep hearing how they're not doing this when they could be doing that, and they need to be doing this, and they need this and that, and this is a malfunctioning organization. What I'm thinking is our folks in Washington who sits on these different boards who are in control of the EPA, they need to go in there and I would say restructure everything and replace people if necessary, because, Mark, this is so important. I'll give you an example.
Okay, well, we're a little bit out of time, Chris. I apologize for that. Mr. Montgomery, go ahead.
Yeah, listen, it's a great point. But I would sharpen it a little bit. The EPA is doing a lot of things well. They're doing this poorly. They're doing this poorly because they don't resource for it. And as the caller said, they're not organized. So I would recommend reorganizing and funding them. The Biden administration, the Trump administration had an increase in this office from about 8 million to 10 million over a few years. The Biden administration just recommended an increase from 10 to 14 million. The real amount that's needed, I think, is around 45 to 50 million. Now, you can't do that in 1 year. That's not efficient. You don't triple a government agency's budget in a year. It's like burning money in an oil barrel. But over a series of 3 to 5 years, grow this office to be the support element to the private sector that they're required to be by law as a sector risk management agency, and so that they can provide us as citizens good oversight. We want a high performing cybersecurity program at EPA, and then get the support from CISA, as I mentioned, get the support from NIST at the Department of Commerce, get a little bit of support from Department of Energy where they have some expertise. And I really think that's the solution. But that it's going to require money. It's small money in the overall EPA budget, but it requires money and organization to get it right.
Mark Montgomery with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You can find the website at fdd.org. Mr. Montgomery, thanks for your time with us today.
Thank you, Pedro. I really appreciate you tackling this issue.